All right, hi everyone. I hope you're doing well. We had just finished reading part A of chapter 4, so I like to break all of our chapters up so we're not reading so much at one time and getting overwhelmed. But the questions that we had for the first part of chapter 4 was, why is Serafina upset with her pa? So if you are following along, you can flip to page 48. And she's finally, we've already known that Serafina, after reading this book, that she's constantly upset with her pa because she doesn't want anyone to see her. And so she has felt like, is he embarrassed of her? And she's mentioned that since chapter 1. But she finally actually voiced her opinion to her pa. It says, she said, "Why have you been hiding me all these years?" she demanded. "Just tell me what's wrong with me. I want to know, why are you ashamed of me?" And then it goes through and he says, "I'm not ashamed of you." That's when he's voicing his opinion. And she, stands her ground. She says, "You are." She trembled in fear, but she wasn't going to give up this time. She wanted to shake him. She wanted to shake him to the core. "You're ashamed of me." So that's why she's upset with her pa, because she doesn't like that feeling of that he is ashamed of her. She's not wanted or anything like that. The second question is, it says, what did Pa find in the woods? If you look on page 52, it says that he found 4 small creatures. And then the more that he examined that creature, whatever that he found in the woods, he realized that it was a human baby curled into a little tiny ball. So he's found a baby in the woods. So this is... Serafina is shocked at this point because she's like, "What? You found a baby? Why? Well, how did it get there?" And she has all these questions. So we stopped in the middle of Pa's story, and that is where we are going to pick up now, is with that story where he was leading us off. All right, everyone, we are starting on chapter 4. So that's where we are. We're halfway through it. We're on page 53, and we're going to be starting at the second sentence that said, "I took her to the midwives." "I took her to the midwives at the convent and begged them to help, but they gasped at the sight of her, muttering that she was of the devil's work. They said that she was malformed, near to death, and that there was nothing they could do to help her." "But why?" Serafina cried in outrage. "That's terrible. That's so mean. Just because something looked different didn't mean you just threw it away." She couldn't help but wonder what kind of world it was out there. The attitude of the midwives almost bothered her more than the idea of the yellow-eyed beast lurking in the night. But she felt a renewed glimmer of admiration for her pa, as she imagined his huge, warm hands wrapped around that tiny little baby's body, giving it heat, keeping it alive. Her father took a long, deep, troubled breath as he remembered the night, and then he continued his story. "You have to understand, the poor little thing had been born with her eyes closed, Sarah, and the nuns said that she would never see. She had been born deaf, and they said that she would never hear. And it was plain enough to see that she had 4 toes on each foot instead of 5. But that was the least of it. Her collarbones were malformed, and she had an unnaturally long curving spine, all twisted like, and she did not look like she could survive." The shock hit her like a blow. She looked up at her father in astonishment. "I'm the baby?" she shouted, leaping to her feet. This wasn't just a story. This was her story. She had been born in the forest. That meant her pa had found her and taken her in. She was like a baby fox who had been raised by a coyote. She stood in front of her pa. "I'm the baby?" she said again. Her pa looked at her, and she saw the truth of it flickering in his eyes, but he didn't acknowledge it. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. It was like he couldn't reconcile his memory of the dark night that with his daughter that he had now, and he had to tell the story the only way he could, as if it wasn't her at all. The bones of the baby's back weren't connected to each other the way that they should have been, he continued. The nuns were half scared out of their wits at the idea of caring for this child, like it had some sort of demon spawn. But to me, she was just a little baby. a little chitlin, and you didn't abandon such a thing. Who cares how many toes she had? Serafina kneeled on the floor in front of him, trying to understand it all. She was beginning to see the kind of man her father was, and maybe where she had gotten some of her own stick-to-itiveness. But it was also confusing. How could she get anything from him if she wasn't even his? I took that baby away, fearing them nuns would drown her, he said. I hate them nuns, she spat. They're terrible. He shook his head, not in disagreement, but more like the nuns didn't mean anything at it all because they were the least of his problems. I didn't have any proper food, he said, so I crept into the farmer's barn and milked his goat. Stole a bottle, too. Felt ashamed doing these things, but I needed to get some food into her. And I couldn't see a better road. That night, I fed the little chitlin her first meal, and as bad off as she was, and with her eyes still closed, she drank it down real good. And I remember praying that somehow it'd help. The more I held her and watched her suck down that milk, the more I wanted her to live. Then what happened? She slid closer to him. She knew that outside the locked door of the electrical room, somewhere above them, the lawful inhabitants of the Biltmore estate were searching from room to room, but she didn't care. Keep going, Pa, she nudged. I looked for a woman who could mother the baby proper, but none of them would do it. They was sure she was gonna die. But 2 weeks later, while I was fixing an engine with one hand and a bottle feeding the chitlin with the other, something happened. She opened her eyes for the first time and stared straight at me. All I could do was stare right back at her. She had these big, beautiful yellow eyes that just didn't stop. I knew then and there that I was hers and she was mine, that we were kin now, and there was no denying it. Serafina was so mesmerized by his story that she barely blinked. The yellow eyes her father spoke of were still looking at him, and they had been for 12 years. He rubbed his mouth slowly with his hand, looked over at the dynamo, and then continued the story. In the time that followed, I fed the little chitlin every morning and every night. I slept with her tucked under my arms. I nestled her in an open toolbox beside me when I worked. When she started growing up a little, I taught her how to crawl and run about. I was trying my best to take care of her. She was mine now, you see. But the people started asking questions, and government types started coming around, men with badges and guns. And one night when I was working in the train yard, 3 of them waited until she wandered off a bit, and then they cornered her, trapped her in real tight. They were going to take her away and put her in some place. God only knows where, or maybe worse. I hit the first officer so hard that he went down bleeding, and he didn't get up. Then I struck a second one and grabbed for the third, but he skedaddled on out of there. The little chitlin was all right, thank God. But I knew we were in trouble. They'd be coming back with more men next time. Chains for me and a cage for the chitlin. I knew then that we had to go. We had to escape the prying eyes and yammering mouths in the city. So I quit the train yard and found a new job way up in the mountains, working on the construction of a great house. She gasped as the realization that she hadn't been hiding her. He had been hiding them. That's why we're in the basement, she thought, as the wave of relief passed through her. He was protecting her. I took care of her through good times and bad, her pa continued, just doing everything I could, and over the years the strange little creature I found in the forest grew up into a fine little girl, and I did my best to forget how she came into the world or how I got her. And here, finally, her father paused and looked at her earnest. And that's you now, Sarah, he said. That's you. It's plain to see that you're not like other girls. But you're not a mishappen or hideous like them nuns said you'd be. You're remarkably graceful in your movement, fast and agile, like I've never seen. You're not deaf and blind, like they said. You're real sharp in your senses. I've been protecting you every day for the last 12 years, and the God's truth, they have been the best 12 years of my life. You mean the world to me, girl. There's no shame here, none at all. Just a strong desire to keep us both alive. When he stopped and looked at her with his steady dark eyes, she realized that she had been sobbing and quickly wiped the tears off her face before he got mad at her for crying. In some ways, she had never felt closer to her pa than at that moment, for his story had snagged her heart. But there was something else roiling up inside of her too. Her father wasn't her father. He had found her in the woods and taken her. He had been lying to her and everyone else for her entire life. All these years, he had refused to talk about her mother, just let her wander on, and now here it was, the truth. Tears kept streaming down her face. She felt so stupid, imagining fancy ladies and her mother forgetting her in a washing machine and all that stuff she used to think about when she was little. She spent countless hours wondering where she came from, and he had known all this the whole time. Why didn't you tell me? She asked him. He didn't answer her. Why didn't you tell me, Pa? She asked again. Staring at the ground, he shook his head slowly back and forth. Pa. Finally, he said, because I didn't want it to be true. She stopped and looked at him in shock. But it is true, Pa. You can't just wish things aren't true when they are true. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said. I just wanted you to be my little girl. She was angry, very angry. But she felt a lump in her throat. He had finally reached deep down into his heart and told her what he was thinking, what he was feeling, what he was frightened of, and what he had dreamed of. And what he had dreamed of was her. She clenched her teeth and breathed through her nose and looked at him. She was angry and confused and amazed and excited and frightened all at the same time. She finally knew the truth, at least some of it. Now, she knew that she didn't just feel different, she was different. The thought of it terrified her. She was a creature of the night. She came from the very forest that her pa had taught her to fear all her life and had forbidden her to enter. The thought of coming from that place repulsed her, scared her, but at the same time there was a strange confirmation in it, almost a relief. It made a twisted kind of sense to her. She looked at her father, sitting with his back against the wall. Now that he had finally told her the story, he seemed exhausted, like a man who had shared a great burden. He picked himself off the floor, brushed off his hands, and walked slowly to the other side of the room, deep in thought. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said. I reckon it ain't gonna do you no good on the inside knowing all that, but you're right. You're growing up now, and you deserve to know. He came over to her and squatted down and held her so that she could look into her face. But whatever you do with it, I want you to remember this one thing. There's nothing wrong with you, Sarah. Nothing at all. You hear? Yeah, I hear you, Pa, she said, nodding and wiping the tears from her eyes. There was a turmoil in her heart, but one thing she knew for sure, her father believed in her. But even as she stood there looking at him, thoughts and questions started weaving through her mind. Would she have to stay hidden forever? Could she ever fit in? Would she have to stay hidden forever? Could she ever fit in with the people of Biltmore? Could she ever make any friends? She was a creature of the night, but what did that mean she could do? She looked down at her hands. If she grew out her fingernails, would they become claws? In the distance, she could hear the sound of the search party moving through the basement, and she tried to block it out. She looked over at her father after a long pause. She quietly asked the question that had been forming in her mind. What about my mother? Her pa shut his eyes for a second as he took a good long breath, and then he opened his eyes and looked at her and spoke to her with an unusual softness. I'm sorry, Sarah. The truth is, I don't rightly know. But when I see her in my mind, I think she must have been a beautiful, both lovely and strong. She fought hard to bring you into the world, Sarah, and she wanted to stay with you, but she knew she couldn't. I don't know why she couldn't, but she gave you to me to love and to care of, and for that, I am much obliged. So maybe she's still out there someplace? Her voice trembled, uncertain. Her pa's story had made it feel like there was a tornado twisting inside of her, but the thought of her mama felt like the bursting of the sun. Maybe she is, he said, He relented gently. She looked at him. Pa, do you think that, do you know if she was human or... I don't want to hear any talk about that, he interrupted her, shaking his head. She could see the tightness of his mouth, how upset her question made him. You're my little girl, he said. That's what I believe. But in the forest, she began. No, he cut her off. I don't want you to think about that. You live here with me. This is your home. I've told you before, and I'll tell you again, Sarah. Our world is filled with many mysteries, things we don't understand. Never go into the deep parts of the forest, for there are many dangers there, both dark and bright, and they will ensnare your soul. She stared at her pa for a long time, trying to comprehend his words. She could see the seriousness in his eyes, and she felt it too deep down in her heart. Her pa was the only person she had ever had in this world. She heard the men coming down the corridor outside the door. They were searching the rooms of the sub-basement. The hair on her arms tingled, telling her to run. She looked at her pa after he had done for her by telling her this story. She didn't want to bring it up again. Didn't want to make him angry. But she had to ask one last question. What about the man who took the girl in the yellow dress? What kind of demon is he, Pa? What does he come out of the forest? Or do you think he's one of the fancy dressed swells from upstairs? I don't know, he said. I've been praying to God in heaven that it was a figment of your imagination. It wasn't, Pa, she said softly. He didn't want to argue with her anymore. He looked straight at her. Don't get it in your head you're gonna go out there, Sarah, he said. It's too dangerous for us. You see why now? I know that you're hankering to help her, and that does you credit, but don't worry about the girl. She's their kin, not ours. They don't need our help. They'll find her. You stay out of it. And at that moment, someone pounded on the heavy wooden door of the electrical room. We're searching the house, a man shouted. Serafina glanced around, even though she already knew that there was no way out of the room. Open this door, shouted another man. Open up. And that is the end of chapter 4. Thanks for listening.